Hello, today I'm going to be presenting my research regarding the separation of church and state, specifically in a broader presentation format accompanying a PowerPoint presentation that is linked and has been submitted with this assignment. So I would suggest, just for the sake of fluidity, that as you listen to this video, you would go along with the corresponding slides in the PowerPoint to get the full experience. All right, so the separation of church and state obviously is an incredibly important concept. I feel like it's so foundational to the American experience that I almost don't need to argue that, though obviously for the sake of this assignment, I will make that argument. But it's also a very controversial topic in American history in that the way that the church and state ought to be separated has huge ramifications on how the government goes about implementing policies regarding this issue. For example, in my introduction, I discuss prayer being taken out of schools, and this is something that I'll address at a later date as well, the specific court case regarding this issue. But obviously that was incredibly controversial. And the whole balance is, do we want religion out of government, or do we want religion protected from government? And I begin by demonstrating the two key positions regarding this so that I can then go on and situate the information about these positions within their historical arguments. The first one I call liberty through restriction, so producing religious liberty through the restriction of how religious ideas are presented in public spaces, such as public schools. And the whole idea is that religion as allowed by the government can act as an obstacle to religious expression broadly. In Engel versus Vital in 1962, which was a Supreme Court ruling, they talk about this case, and basically they rule that it's unconstitutional for a school to have a school prayer that it then instructs or encourages the students to recite. This was not a close decision. This was a 6-1 decision, which suggests that this was very strongly felt by the Supreme Court at the time. And this was based on the idea of the Establishment Clause, which is a key thing that we'll discuss going forward. But for the sake of time, I'll move on to the counterposition, the one that I will be largely supporting throughout my work here. Liberty through protection, key distinction there. This is a counter-argument that approaches religious liberty not by the secularization of public spaces, but by protecting religious expression from government law. And this relies more on a strict interpretation of the Establishment Clause and often appeals to the religious nature of the nation's founding and the religious nature of the nation, broadly speaking. This is something I'll talk about more towards the conclusion, but the idea that the American people are inherently a religious people and that the nation and government, by extension, exist to serve those people, then by nature should not infringe upon their ability to act religiously. This sort of logical progression is the sort of thing that you'll see argued by people who argue for maybe a more strict interpretation of the Establishment Clause. But I can hear you wondering, what is the Establishment Clause? Because it's so foundational to this conversation we're having about religious freedom in the United States. A key thing that's pointed out by Walter Benjamin is the distinct lack of religious language in the Constitution, which is striking considering the religious nature of many of the nation's founders, which I can't help but think is an intentional, thought-out decision. And the implications of this are quite significant and impact the way that you're going to then interpret the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause, for clarity, is from the First Amendment, which states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's from the Bill of Rights, obviously the First Amendment. With any legal case, it's incredibly helpful to look at historical context, the language of the founders, These are key ideas that help us determine what did this actually mean, because when there's something as vague as that, it's necessary to look at further context to help explain maybe what the true intention was there. The founding father that I and many other scholars have chosen to focus on regarding this issue is Thomas Jefferson. Obviously an incredibly influential figure in the founding of the United States as a nation. And he had many things to say about the establishment of religious liberty in the United States. He's most famously connected with the phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. This is an incredibly important thing to understand because it's used almost synonymously with the Establishment Clause as if it were part of the Constitution, though it was actually introduced in an 1802 letter to Danbury Baptist, obviously significantly after the writing of the Constitution. I think that looking at the nature of the statement suggests that the wall of separation is not actually meant to protect government from religious ideas, but rather to protect religion and religious ideas from the government. And to further explore this point, I'm going to reference key scholars who've discussed this and broached this issue in the past to better substantiate that position. So John Ragasta argues that religious persecution and political dissenters being mistreated because of religious beliefs in Virginia inspired Thomas Jefferson to seek to protect the American people from state-sponsored religious persecution. So again, it's the people being protected from the government, not the government from religion. Walter Benjamin, again referencing him, believes that Jefferson interpreted the Establishment Clause as providing freedom for religion, not freedom from it. Again, for religious expression and not freedom from religious expression. That's a very important distinction. And I believe that these ideas cooperate to support the idea that the government was viewed as the threat to liberty and not the only means by which it could be sustained, which I believe is a consistent idea in the Constitution. But for sake of time, I'll move on here to Richard Hoskins, who I thought had a really interesting quote from a legal perspective regarding this. I'll read it for you here. It says, "The religious declaration of the First Amendment did not decree separation of church and state. It assumed it." And then it continues on. "Separation must come before free exercise and not establishment." So the idea is that religious liberty can only exist within the context that church and state are separate. Once again, that a religious state inherently pushes back against free religious expression on the part of the citizens broadly. And then Arthur Dreisbeck says that the language of the Establishment Clause places restrictions on Congress exclusively, right? That it's not meant to restrict the nation, but rather just Congress so that they cannot infringe upon the rights of the people. All right, moving forward. But what did they need protection from? What's the historical inspiration for this? I believe that European churches, specifically the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church, provided key inspiration for this idea. Many coming from England, including those who would settle in Massachusetts, right, at Plymouth Plantation, were seeking to avoid the influence of the Anglican Church and its domineering control of their lives, or at least their religious lives. And many moved to the Netherlands, though they wished to avoid the overbearing influence of the Dutch people on their families and their children. So when they moved to the colonies, it was freedom from the Anglican Church that was a necessary component of their move. Second, we have the Roman Catholic Church, which is famously very influential in governance, especially in Central Europe, including France and Spain as well in Western Europe. It had an incredibly large impact on the lives of many people, and in fact operated as a governmental structure for hundreds of years within Europe. Many coming to the United States as immigrants, as the nation was founded on, were carrying these experiences and these ideas, and there was a general idea that moving away from those things would be good for the nation, though these ideas were not represented consistently throughout the whole nation as southern states had stronger ties to the Anglican Church than the northern states did. Continuing on here, despite Massachusetts being initially founded with the idea of religious liberty, this conception was more religious liberty within the context that they wanted it, which was Puritan influence. And individuals that strayed from that often were treated poorly or excommunicated. The most extreme example of religious thought being used to persecute people in Massachusetts, of course, is the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials were an extreme example where 20 people died, depending on, obviously, your sources for that. Basically, because there was the idea that they were witches or were participating in witchcraft or were accomplices to that. And the hysteria surrounding this whole situation demonstrated how dangerous unchecked state-sponsored religion could be, and I think validates the general claim that it was the people who needed to be protected from the state and not the state from the people, as it was not the government being destabilized, it was the whole community of free individuals being infringed upon by the government. And this does, I think, though it is an extreme example, reflect upon a general problem in the nation, which was state religions being used to determine who was and wasn't allowed to have political influence or vote, which both stopped religious expression but also stopped appropriate governance, in my opinion. All right. And circling back to the idea of the United States as a religious nation, this is a very foundational idea in the United States, one that was supported by Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas in the Zorach versus Clausen case in 1952, stating that we are a religious people, and though not everyone is religious, the spirit of the nation and the laws that were made up, at the time of the nation's founding, support the idea that religion was a key idea, a key influence, and a key motivator for the nation's founding, the creation of its laws, and the building of its monuments, which I think reflect this Christian influence. In conclusion, this religious influence on the United States is undeniable. How then should the government reflect that? I would argue, as I think Thomas Jefferson would, that it is the people who need to be protected from the government overreaching and infringing upon personal liberties. How this should be applied is a more complicated matter, but I would suggest that the secularization of public spaces is not a solution to the problem, but rather supports the incorrect idea that religion is a threat to governance, as opposed to the other way around. I love the idea that the Establishment Clause protects religion from the government, not the government from religion. And in general, I think that these ideas are supported by historical precedent, quotes from the founders, including Thomas Jefferson, and the general religious nature of the United States. Thank you very much.